You are listening to the Enormocast.
So many of you probably feel like it's a flex to bring your grubby outdoor gear to the gym. Yes, we see the red dirt on your big wall harness, sir, and we all know you were doing real climbing over the weekend. But the rest of us know that it's almost essential to have kit that's packed just for the gym and not mixed up with our outdoor stuff, and Black Diamond has you covered there too. Check out the Mondito Chalk Pot for those bouldering sessions when wearing your chalk bag makes you look like a doof. The Stone 42 Duffel is perfect for the arduous approach when the parking lot is, pretty full. And the AirNet harness is the lightest, fastest harness around since, as we've noted many times before, you can leave your cordelettes, your spare belay device, the knife, the bell beaners, the walkie-talkies, cams, nuts, straws, extra lockers at home when you red point the new 12A in the gym. Finally, BD's casual climbing apparel like the Craig denim pants can flit from the gym to the street to the cliff without a care and make you look oh so chill when you dry fire and land flat on your back with a loud thwap. So let Black Diamond kit you out for the gym and the crag by going to blackdiamondequipment.com or your favorite local gym pro shop. And make your next gym flex be simply giving a good belay and some encouragement to a total stranger. When it comes to Sportiva, I often praise the longevity of their venerated classics like the Mira. Because, well, if it ain't Baroque, don't fix it. Italian Baroque, that is. But as we know, I'm a stick in the mud whose glory days are well behind him. But you, dear listener, still have your best days waiting to jump out at you like a puppy wearing a backpack full of caramel corn. So hey, forward thinkers, let's take a gander at what's new over at Sportiva.com. The redesigned Cantana lace is an absolute edging machine. The updated Tarantula line provides comfort and performance at a price point for everybody. The TX2 Evo adds even more performance to Sportiva's stow and go approach shoes. And the new Mantra is a minimalist slipper so light and flowy, you'll swear you accidentally showed up to the gym in only your underwear. Just like in that dream you had last night. Don't worry, I just looked down too. So when it comes to keeping you thinking ahead, Sportiva is there with innovation at every turn. Why not see what's up and head over to Sportiva.com or follow them on Instagram. And remember, Sportiva is a proud sponsor of the Enormocast.
Listen, where are you playing in town? You playing here?
We're doing the Enormo Dome, whatever it is. It's terrific.
Oh,
it's
yeah, the
big
big
house.
place, that side of town. That's a big place. You sold it out.
20,000 seats.
You
really should.
Look, you better get up there before you panic. Those pens are loose. You're very good. I have really enjoyed climbing with you. We'll make it. I don't think so. But we shall continue with style. Weather, bad weather. Now or later, anytime for climbing.
Today's show is brought to you by Black Diamond Equipment, La Sportiva, and with support from Maxim Ropes. Maxim has been keeping the Enormocast off the deck since 2012.
And don't forget our charter sponsor, Bonfire Coffee. Go to bonfirecoffee.com and enter Enormo at checkout for a discount on great coffee and to support the Enormocast.
And now back to the show.
Hello and welcome to the Enormocast. This is your host, Chris Kalous. It is May 2nd, about 10 a.m. here in Colorado, 2022, and this is episode 241, a conversation with climber, author, Jonathan Howland. And who is Jonathan Howland? Well, he is someone who did something audacious, risky, vulnerable. He wrote a literary fiction novel about rock climbing and then published it. I know. It's like free soloing the Dawn Wall. Not exactly, but this is an interesting thing because there actually is very little legacy of climbing fiction being successful. And I started to kind of filter through just the few sort of famous works in my mind. And I got rid of the thrillers, the sort of climbing adjacent things like Eiger Sanction, or a lot of Jeff Long's writing has sort of a climbing background, but some sort of caper thriller. thing, plot-driven thing going on in there. I got rid of the mountaineering books, even the fiction ones. It's pretty typical to, have your summit mountain crucible in your fictional adventure or novel. So got rid of those and left me with just like who's writing literary fiction about rock climbing. I could only actually think of Chris Coleman, who wrote As Above, So Below, but that, was a self-published thing, didn't go out to that many people. Yeah, so who's writing big novels, character-driven novels about rock climbing? Almost nobody. Well, I'm sure it's not nobody, so you guys can message me with your suggestions. But, like I said, filters. Rock climbing, novel, literary fiction. What's literary fiction? Look it up. But here's a hint. There can't be spies trying to kill each other. There was a frayed end on your rope, and I'm cutting it out. And frankly, I was skeptical when approached with this book, Native Air, because I am not drawn to climbing fiction. I find the real-world stuff is plenty exciting and interesting and fascinating and full of surprises. However, I got into it. Reluctantly, it dragged me in, and by the end of the book, I was fascinated and astounded at what Jonathan had created. Like all literature, we're looking at real-life themes that sort of thrum the very bass notes of why we climb. So then I pursued to have Jonathan on, and what we have here is a very meditative, slow-burn interview about writing process, about those themes, about who Jonathan is and how it influenced his book. And no, I don't think you have to have read the book to enjoy this interview, because we go way beyond the book. But to get you stoked, and because I'm a fanboy of William Finnegan, author of Barbarian Days, come on the show, Bill. Always got a mic open for you, but I'm going to read his endorsement of Native Air, and then we'll go to the interview. Quote, there are people whose obsession is big wall climbing. You may have seen the documentaries, read the articles, perhaps even read a memoir, but you've never read anything that takes you so deep inside the anchoritic psyche of helpless, abject cliff worship. The narrator is ambivalent and supremely observant. His partner is an absolutist. See Ishmael and Ahab, Sal Paradiso and Dean Moriarty. This is literary fiction of a high order, with a physical immediacy and a specificity that never let up, and then a riveting next-generation denouement. The final top-out will destroy you. Climb on. William Finnegan. And don't worry, I also had to look up anchoritic.
I'm pretty much positive, Chris, that I'm the least interesting climber you've ever hosted on your show. So, grew up in Santa Barbara area, moved to LA when I was in middle school. Just found it so depressing, the LA suburbs, after living in slightly more rural, Mediterranean, mountainous, southern central coast. And it turns out that my pediatrician in LA was a mountaineer. In addition to running his medical office, he ran a thing called an explorer post, but it wasn't, they didn't wear uniforms or pay dues. But somehow under the auspices of I guess, BSA, Boy Scouts of America, maybe they got some insurance, he ran an explorer post that was focused on mountaineering, almost all Sierra, although they went to South America and other states. So I got hooked up with them when I was, 13. And at some point, some little subgroup of them took me, and I was much younger, to Joshua Tree, 1974. And that's where I first did technical, steep things. And, I was really smitten. And then it became, it was pretty much an obsession for age 14 to 20, 21, culminating in a really kind of disappointing, grim, depressing season in Yosemite in the fall of 81. And then I pretty much quit. I mean, I backpacked, I hiked, I tagged some summits, but I didn't do anything technical for, 20 years. Had a teaching career, had 2 kids, had 2 marriages, had, lots of, depressive episodes and, lots of happy times too. But climbing was not part of my life at all. And then I reconnected with a college friend David Goldstein, who's a great climber, Boulder, Colorado, and a lifelong acolyte and advocate. And he and I met in Joshua Tree. I hadn't seen him in 15 years or more, and did some routes, and it's just like, wow, talk about lighting an old flame. And that's 20 years ago, and since then I've been even more obsessed. I've just been climbing a lot in the last 20 years.
So when you got back into it, was it happenstance or was it a premeditated thing? Did you have a moment where you're like, God, I missed that and I should go check it out again? Or how did that happen? How did it rekindle itself, like logistically?
I think it happened on Mount Humphreys. I started doing more backpacking, more peak bagging, and my kids were a little older and I had a little more independence and time. And I started enjoying doing things that were steeper. It just kind of came from inside. And then I thought, well, shit, I want to do that. I've always wanted to do that route on Humphreys. It's 4th class, but I don't really want to do it on rope. So I got some gear, or pulled out some old gear, I forget, and got 2 friends, neither of whom was really a climber. And we went up and did it, and it was fabulous. And then, of course, that same summer, Cathedral Peak and other sort of moderate 5th class things. And then I think it was after that I actually met Dave in Joshua Tree. So it was something kind of welling up from inside. It really surprised me. But of course, the other wrinkle here is that, when I was a kid and then later as a young adult, there were no such thing as climbing gyms. And so I had heard of them. This is actually something that's very much featured. It's a obviously, thank God, a minor feature, but it exists in part 2 of the novel, that the narrator wanders into a climbing gym after having not been in climbing for a long time, and he's kind of like, what the hell is this? And he kind of denigrates it as a gross, attempted facsimile of the real thing. And of course, that's sort of how I felt too, but I was also got somewhat obsessed with gym climbing, partly because of that facsimile, just that, I don't know, cousin of climbing that we can do indoors, and it's so close and convenient. And there's a bit of a climbing culture there too. In fact, that's where I started meeting some other climbers. Chris Stone, the fairly well-known climber Jason Wells, and I became really good friends and met at the gym, and then a whole host of others. So a lot of the climbing I've done in the last 20 years has been with people that I met at the gym or met through people at the gym. Yeah, so that's a curiosity. What was the time frame between 1981 and I think that's when you said you walked away from it to come back? It's like 2000, okay, 19 years, yeah. Yeah, 19 years and a lot of changes in climbing. Oh, completely. I mean, I'd read about them a little bit. I'd read about gyms. Mm-hmm. I'd read about sport climbing, which didn't exist in 1981. But I didn't know anything about I wasn't even curious, frankly. I just thought, that was an interesting phase of my life. It's over. But getting back into it was really, really healing in some ways, because I think I left a little chagrined and wounded and disappointed, and came back. And again, a lot of thanks to Dave, because he's kind of a master of the craft. The guy that climbed Astroman in good style at age 45 for the first time. Just being with him and sort of learning how to do things more intentionally and with greater savvy, that was hugely helpful to me. Well, it's interesting, too, if you said you came back in 2000 or so, and which is kind of the dawn of the gym era in a lot of ways. They've been around through the 90s, but very rare, and kind of more of these like training dungeons. You're in San Francisco, so you were probably at Mission Cliffs, right? Yeah, I was in Mission Cliffs, which is a really light, airy, sunny side of the city place to be. Kind of, as gyms go, it's pretty decent. I was there yesterday. And it was like an early, that was an early big deal gym. I was down in LA at the Recreations, which, I was just joking with somebody recently how sort of small and dingy they are now. But these were a couple of the early gyms that really were creating, I think the roots of what we call gym culture. But the other thing is we equate all this stuff, I too can be negative about gyms or whatever. Us olds, we have a tendency to look askance, but Recreation in LA, Mission Cliffs, where you were, became like the focal point of the actual outdoor climbing community too. Like we hadn't yet like created this echelon of pure gym climbers in a lot of ways. So I can imagine walking in there was like returning actually to the
climbing scene, gym or outside or whatever. It was
Absolutely.
The climbing scene.
And even seeing, Hans Florine would come through and just working out, or Jim Herson was there all the time, and then his kids, and seeing their family when the kids were infants and they were just dragging them around in little car seats while the parents could climb. Yeah, it's kind of crazy.
Do you want to talk about 1981, or do we want to talk about it in context of the book?
It's not that interesting, really. It's just,
okay.
I mean,
you just dropped it there, and I have to pick it up a little bit.
Sure. The thing that's interesting to me about it is that I think if there is a significant overlap, and of course everybody wants to know this, who's interested in the book, is, am I the narrator? And I would too emphatically reject that. But if there is a significant overlap, it's in who I was as a younger person, as a younger man. And I think the bigger piece of this was just a little bit of a seeker, a depressive, and someone who kind of freighted climbing with meanings that it couldn't either sustain or support and didn't deserve. And I think that's what I was like at age 19, 20, 21. And when I got back to it, I was freer, and a lot able to experience climbing for what it is and not for what I needed it to be, and also just more self-possessed, and also just generally lighter in spirit and all that. So yeah, so in 81, we a couple things happened. One, we were in Yosemite for 2 months. It rained a shit ton. I took a horrendous fall on Rickson's Pinnacle on a route that's no longer open because of loose rock. It had nothing to do with loose rock. It had to do with incompetent climbing. But, a good 40, 50 footer, on a stopper. And that was scary. But probably more scary was 2 days later, we ascended Half Dome vis-a-vis the regular Northwest Face route. And it took 3 days. So we were 3 days on the wall. Three of us, Dave Goldstein, Bill Zildjian, and I, at the margin of our competence, maybe past it, moving very slowly, hauling, all that stuff. And, we did it. We summited. We ate it a lot. But it wasn't fun, and it wasn't really that satisfying. And then in November, I moved to San Francisco and did an internship at the Sierra Club for the winter, and that was kind of a little dark, too. So, yeah, I don't know. I think if my life circumstances had been a little different, I might have stayed in climbing longer, but got involved with a woman who wasn't a climber and needed to land on my feet professionally after college. I didn't come from money or have any money, so I really had to get a job right away. Got into other sports, too. So
right. Yeah, I mean, you're sort of you're dropping like self-describing yourself as a depressive or these dark times. Is climbing now a part of dealing with that, or do you find it to be this like you said, you're more light now? Did that happen with the climbing, or is it just kind of irrelevant to that?
I don't know. I think climbing might perhaps has helped. I'm not sure. I mean, there's some things that I like about climbing that have nothing to do with climbing, and one of them is just the discipline of having to be fit enough. I'm not a natural. I'm not like a kid who, could have made the gymnastics team. So for me to be able to climb at my best, which, by your program standards is not particularly accomplished. But for me to be able to climb in a way that's satisfying to me, I really have to be focused all the time on it. Not just, I can't climb my way into, competence. I have to train. I have to, exercise and all that stuff, and be sort of mentally available to the activity when I get there. And I really like that about climbing. And yeah, I think that's helped me sort of just generally psychologically as well. I like that about a lot of things. I like that about writing. I like that about distance running. I like it about yoga. I like it about sleep.
So let's talk a little bit about you as a writer. I would assume, I don't know this actually, but I would assume that you didn't just pick up the pen or, ergo the word processor at the moment you started this book. So let's talk a little bit about your path with writing, who you are as a writer, and then I think we can seg into what the hell you were thinking writing a novel about climbing.
Well, writing is sort of my other obsession, And, native air is the intersection in this Venn diagram between sort of two obsessions that I've had for a long time. But writing probably even longer. I even tried to write about that season in Yosemite in the 1980s. Couldn't get anywhere with it or on it or even understand it enough to do anything artful. Since the late 80s, I've been an on and off the wagon fiction writer. And in that time, I've, produced 20 pieces of short fiction, a novella, another novel, none of which are published, although I think there's path now to a collection of 8 or 9 of the short stories to get published. It's with an editor now. Like I said, on and off the wagon, I sort of get a notion and pursue it and really enjoy the process. Usually it's always a fight, but there's something sort of sublime and satisfying about it too. I feel that some of my sort of happier or more content periods of life have been when I haven't had the writing bug. But in 2013, had a bunch of kind of life changes around 2010 when my marriage ended, and then a year later when I got together with Courtney, I call her my unmarried spouse now, and that's 11 years, and just healthier places for me in so many ways, not the least of which is just not fighting the battle of self-acceptance, not dreading the future quite as much as I used to. And in 2013, I was on a climbing trip with a friend, Dan Rampey, in the Eastern Sierra, a week-long junket, sort of hitting up a bunch of crags day after day, and then with an objective sort of in the middle. And this one was, I think, the North Buttress of Mount Good outside of Bishop, but up on the crest, a really nice, long, technical route. And I think the day after the Mount Good climb, a rest day, I went into a coffee shop there in Bishop, Stellar Brew, and took a bunch of notes on this thing that had been cooking in me for a while. I wasn't even thinking about it, but some part of me was aware of it. Just took a bunch of notes. So that was 2013 in June. In December of that year, my good friend, really good friend and climbing partner, and someone whom I met at the gym, Bill Beckwith, went on a number of trips with in the Sierra, Eastern Sierra, Red Rock, Nevada. And he was with me through that period of kind of personal tumult, so, like 2008 to 2013. Anyway, in December, he died in a car, he got hit by a car. He was on his motorcycle right here in the city, and it was just gutting. I mean, it's just, it's always hard to remember and to talk about. Yeah, you have to use a razor on this part. But anyway, that grief was, I'd felt grief before, but there was something about it that also I felt this awful personal loss and also this kind of injustice around it. And the absurdity too, that, somebody who was, he had ridden his motorcycle to the tip of South America from Divisadero and McAllister Street in San Francisco on a more than year-long trip and nearly died of appendicitis in Argentina. And a lot of that motorcycle ride was on back roads and dirt roads, and that he would just get creamed at, Steiner and Fell in San Francisco. It was horrible and absurd. So I don't know, that was a hard winter, 2013, 2014, and I didn't realize it at the time, but when I started looking at my notes again for what became Native Air, I had a whole nother angle, and basically the narrator and the narrative point of view was kind of birthed out of the grief that I felt, I think, for losing Bill. And it was weirdly coherent to me and available, and I started working on it in 2014, and it became a weekends and vacations obsession because I had this job and I couldn't do them on the same day because the job was very crowded in my mind, or crowded my mind, and took 3 years basically to get the first draft out. But it was a super satisfying obsession. I mean, as I was approaching the end in 2017, I was grieving again. I was really sad that this was over. Of course, now that seems ridiculous because it took 5 years to get to publication, and lots of revisions and lots of disappointments, way more disappointments than satisfactions in the last 5 years. But
disappointments, you mean with the process of
it took a year. A year to
Yeah.
find an agent.
Right.
Then finding an agent and thinking, kind of a really accomplished agent, thinking, well, this is the ticket, and realizing it's not. And then, getting this great endorsement from a Pulitzer Prize winning writer, Bill Finnegan, as well as a great climbing writer, and Dan Duane, and some other credible sources too, and finding out that that's not the ticket. It's just one thing after another. Publishing is a racket.
Yeah, it's difficult. I mean, you're treading into a realm with climbing fiction. I think it's fiction, period. But then if you sort of like drill down to it being climbing fiction, yeah, I mean, it's always been I think it's been a little bit of a tough road for climbing fiction to get out there. And I'm definitely wary of it sometimes. I find that a lot of it's just a retelling of the real life stuff, and the real life stuff can be, it's already pretty damn compelling, I mean, all that aside, like, was that at all in your head, or was this just I'm writing this thing, I don't care what the history of success in climbing fiction is, or success in climbing literature is. This is this is what
entirely.
I'm saying.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not interested in climbing literature, fiction or nonfiction. I'm incredibly poorly read. I didn't read James Salter's Solo Faces until 3 months ago. That was deliberate, because when I started working on this, and a couple of people found out, they told me about Salter, and I was like, well, sure, I'll read it, but not till I'm done. I don't want to have any taints here. As well as suffer any, humiliations. No, when I started this, it was purely quixotic. I mean, I'm not, I don't have illusions about being a successful writer, which is very freeing. It means that I can kind of, follow my best instincts. On the other hand, I'm kind of a literary person. The writers I like are, Faulkner and Melville and Toni Morrison and Emily Dickinson. They're mountaintop stuff, if you ask me. So when I started working on this, I realized that there was going to be climbing in this novel, and there was going to have to be a sort of core of whatever it is, tension and trust and fear in the primary relationship that was forged out of climbing, or in and through climbing. So there would at times be a kind of saturation in climbing activity, and a lesser extent in climbing culture. And is that going to be off-putting to a reader? Well, my first thought was, I may not finish it. No one's going to read it. If I thought it were any good, I wouldn't be able to find a publisher, et cetera, et cetera. And, at the same time, telling myself, and this sounds horribly pretentious, but it's just the truth, that this is what Melville did with Moby Dick, is to write a story that is, centered around whaling, but it's not really about whaling. In his case, it's about philosophy and epistemology and exploration and juxtaposed worldviews and sort of sloughing off his kind of Judeo-Christian upbringing, or the narrators, rather. And I, too, had this compelling narrator, I think, in Joe Howland, who's trying to unlearn and to learn and to grow, like Ishmael and Moby Dick. And I felt if I could make that story compelling, I could trust that the reader would put up with a lot of unfamiliar jargon, vernacular, and activity. And, I also put in some handholds in the name of a glossary, and occasional little, disquisitions or digressions that might make something that's arcane or obscure a little bit more accessible to a non-climbing person. And I'm really looking for the non-climber audience. I mean, to me, a climber liking this novel is just too easy, because there have been too few climbing novels that are available to us and that are compelling and that also have that also explore, things like grief and friendship and recovery and all that. But for a non-climber, I think it's a little. My hope is it's an invitation into an interesting world.
You also it felt like you wanted to be faithful and, get it right and sort of honor the parts of climbing that are super esoteric and weird and would be. I mean, when I sit down and have to explain them to somebody, since Howland, blew everything up and you have to tell your relatives all about climbing now. It's like I even as a person who talks about it all the time, I get bogged down, in the fact that you've got these sections where, these people are trying to uphold these ethics around bolting and, all those sorts of things. You're so in the weeds with that stuff if you sit down and try to explain it to somebody that doesn't climb.
Yeah.
But it felt like you still wanted to keep this real faithful picture of climbing. And it's what kept me in the book. I think if you had started to go off into fantasy land with climbing or dumbing it down, I probably would have left. So can you talk to that about your sort of faithfulness to what it is we do as climbers, and even when it gets weird and ethical and insecure in reality, if you will?
Yeah. Just that was really easy for me. First of all, because you described kind of my own relationship to climbing, which is obsessive and deep, and the topography of climbing culture is of real interest, genuine interest to me, and I know about it and I talk about it with others and that sort of thing. But I'm also aware that non-climbers just generally aren't that interested, and too much explanation is lost on them. So after a while, I think a lot of those questions, even if they're earnest, they're unanswerable. I think you kind of have to have been there at your edge to appreciate, Howland making that move in free solo. Otherwise it just looks like some gymnastic hijink type of thing. This stuff about, gear and ethics and, whether you had a top rope or not, all that stuff that's just so potent for us just doesn't make any sense to my aunts and uncles, even if they ask about it. But I wanted to be faithful to it. I wanted a climber or a non-climber to be getting something that I felt was real and true and the best I could do around flavor and feeling of things, is why it matters. And then I think what I managed to do was, just by having this first person narrative point of view, which was just, I'm so grateful that I figured that out early. It got me out of having a lot of those complications between how much explanation, how much detail, how much vernacular. I just needed to tell it the way Joe would tell it. I needed to know this narrator's sensibility and perspective as truly as I could. And so that became my benchmark. But, just the other night I did first reading of the novel at the kind of book launch. And let me read a line or two lines. I'd known Pete through dozens of close calls and too many epics and accidents. Cold nights on exposed cliffs, mad dashes from and to summits and lightning storms, bloodied fingers and hands, plenty of falling rock. I watched him zipper his gear off an aid pitch on the head wall of El Cap, hurtling 60 feet past popping pins and copperheads before my belay caught him, and then whipping in a wild pendulum across the face just at the level of our stance so that when he flew by me, inches away, I could see the fright in his eyes, though when he swung back several seconds later, he was cackling and howling, thrilled to be alive. There's a lot there that's really unavailable, sort of in kind of detail and in the technical stuff to the non-climber, not the least of which would be popping pins and copperheads. There's no asterisk there. There's no italics or explanation. I don't think either of those. Maybe pin or piton is in the glossary, but I don't think copperhead is. It might be. But point is, you don't need to, my feeling is, you don't need to have a visual on poppy pins and copper heads and having this, zippering your gear, which is a phenomenon that every climber knows about, but no non-climber does, to have some sense of the I don't know what to call it, the drama and the gravity of that particular passage. Because really, it's just about what Joe experiences in Pete's eyes. The fright and then the delight, as well as the fact that, they're tethered together.
I mean, you kind of drill down on so many of the symbolic things that I don't know if we even, as climbers, I mean, we sort of talk about them, we feel them, but, I think part of climbing, especially in the era when you've got your two sort of main protagonists in the height of their climbing, like, I don't know if we really think deeply about these things, but the thing sort of I enjoyed about the book is the way you're elucidating this bond. There's the metaphorical bond, but then there's the brotherhood of the rope or whatever cliche part of that we talk about. And then going into something that we kind of glibly say, like, well, if you climb long enough, you're going to know someone who dies. That could be something that doesn't mean anything to a 22-year-old, and you can say it and laugh it off. But I've been in here long enough to have lived that, and so is that kind of I guess as we move beyond the technical thing. Were those sort of your North Star ideas that you're trying to use this narrative to get to, or what were your sort of lodestar ideas as you were barreling through the narrative, if you will?
Well, I don't know if I had them. I might have had them unconsciously, and then they sort of bubbled up into my notes, into my thinking about what's next. But I knew very early on that the novel would be fundamentally about grief. And so the work of the early part of the novel was to establishing or evoking. Establishment is the wrong fucking verb by a mile, but evoking, characterizing, playing with, dramatizing a relationship of such power and love that it would sustain the experience, or that it would trigger and sustain the experience of grief that the rest of the novel would be about. Yeah, I mean, I knew that's where I was headed. More mysterious to me, I think, was how I was going to kind of, I don't know, finish it or recover, how there would be something that was redemptive. And that's, I think I get there. Again, I don't want to give away too many of the gooey details, but, there is this big mystery. I don't know if it's a big mystery. It's a little mystery. It's a mystery even to me about the death that's central in the novel. And that is that, this person died soloing, and begs the question, how reckless was he, going through a hard time in his marriage at the time of his death? Were there any suicidal impulses? What's the line between recklessness and suicidal impulse? I was kind of interested in those questions, not so much trying to answer them or resolve them, but actually trying to look at how the living negotiate their feelings and their memories around someone whom they're in love with, who's who died soloing.
The other sort of big question I have, or I had while reading it too, was your decisions around the historical part of the narrative. You've set it in the East Side, the Sierra, and in a certain kind of pretty long time period, and then you've chosen sort of historical markers to kind of set that, I believe. And another author could have chosen to, it's instead of Ron Kauk, it's Bob whatever, you could play with the names or whatever, but you decided to use these parts of history that kind of flit in and out or would be swirling around this era. So how did you sort of decide those elements, what goes in, what stays out, and how you think adding some of that stuff drives the narrative? Because, again, I mean, a lay person that doesn't know the history is going to not make these connections that I made to him, and specifically what you just talked about in terms of John Backer, who died soloing, and maybe in some circumstances that were similar to your protagonist in his everyday life. So I just kind of was like, well, was that part of it? Is he telling me something with these things? Like, what was going on with your decisions around that?
I might not know, and I also might be just like like dodging the question, but my answer is verisimilitude. I was just aiming for, I want this to be credible and kind of situated in a historical context. There are all these great climbers that we all know. And then there's like a whole lot of other devotees, some of whom are really great. My friend Jason Wells was a great climber, but no one has ever heard of him because he didn't climb 514. He just climbed 513, just held the speed record on, the naked edge, just, did multiple routes on El Cap in a day, dozens of times. But no one's ever heard of him. And I wanted Pete and Joe to be sort of in that group, maybe not quite as accomplished as Jason, but certainly as accomplished as many of the regulars at the Crags, and fully invested during that 10-year period after the so-called golden age of, Yosemite free climbing and the Stone Masters and all that, but before the boom, before climbing became a thing in popular culture, and certainly well before the gym thing took off. And I feel like there was this lull, this kind of sweet spot there in the 1980s where it was still pretty quiet. You could still get a campsite in Yosemite, and the Owens Gorge hadn't been built up, but it was, late 80s, just starting to be discovered. Other sport crags like that. Smith, I think, took off in the 80s. So that's what I was aiming for. So these guys were kind of on the scene when the scene was over, but there was, something else developing around the edges. It was developing super slowly. It was very unhyped. And it was, it was a great time to be a serious, devoted, obsessed rock climber because it was pretty quiet. Just personal experience too. When I would go up to the meadows in the late 90s, early 2000s, even now, last summer, even, I'd always run into Ron Kauk and I was at the Owens Gorge last month. I saw Peter Croft. You just see it's like kind of going to the playground, and there's Michael Jordan shooting free throws. These guys, they're still around, and I felt like Pete and Joe were two who were around so much of the time that Backer would recognize them, and if he didn't know their names, he would might play music with Pete in the meadow as he did in that one scene. Kauk would give them some beta and lend them a cam if they're doing some obscure out in the meadows. That just struck me as very realistic, very plausible.
Yeah, and it's funny because I know I was like, even starting this interview, I'm like, well, what's like autobiographical? Where are these things coming from? Which, smartly and deftly, you're like, no, that's not me. And it's, just because my last name is really similar to my narrator, there's nothing to do with me, and that's cool. But like as a writer, and as a climber, you can't avoid these life experience things like seeping in there. And I would imagine you too looked at those guys from afar, even when you were in your obsessive period, because that would have been the height of, really the height of their period too, up till the end of the 70s, and they obviously went on to, but that's like the storied era when those guys were young and ripped and getting after it. So would they have been around like when you were obsessed?
When I was a kid, I think I saw John Long and Lynn Hill, and I'm pretty sure Backer at Joshua Tree, but I didn't know enough to know who they were. They were just there in Hidden Valley. I would run into...
Wait a second, there wasn't they weren't like glowing and mystical and like stuff coming off of them?
If I'd known who they were, they would have been, but I didn't. But when I used to see Dean Potter all the time in the valley, 15 years ago, he was glowing and mystical because I knew who he was.
Because you knew. Yeah. Well, it's cool. I chuckled when you started talking about the 80s and like this sort of period, because I go on endlessly on this podcast about how like the 80s got missed in history, and I'm sort of here to bring it to life, and talk to some of these climbers that were active then and really changed the way we climbed and set up the way we climbed, and so I found that compelling too, because I could feel that era. I don't recall if you name years in there or not, but if even if you didn't, I kind of felt who these guys were and the sort of community and how that was an era when you could be extremely rad and doing, cutting edge stuff and be unknown. I mean, you still can, but it was like there was very little pathway to sort of fame in climbing at that point anyway.
Yeah, I mean, that's
only these handful of like visionaries really floated to the top anyway.
Right. And that's what, that's, you're kind of describing what it is that drives Pete Hunter, and Joe as well in the 80s is, the capacity to be fully invested, to live for it, to work winters so they can climb 8 months of the year, to live dirt baggedy mostly, and to do first ascents on great, sometimes very remote Sierra walls because they're there for the taking, for the picking. It's just I think it's Chenard who said, people are going to take these Yosemite techniques and use them in more remote places. And Joe says in the novel, he writes in the novel, he had it wrong. What they did instead is they upped the technical difficulties of the things they were doing, near roads. And mostly that's true. But in the 80s, man, if you wanted to climb, 5'9" to 5'11" on long technical routes in the Sierras, it was wide open. So all their first ascents are basically from early 80s to 1989. The last thing they attempt together is this, north whatever it's called, Northeast Direct on Mount Moriah.
Which is fictional, right?
Yeah.
There's no Mount Moriah, is there?
There is no Mount Moriah. Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of routes in the novel that aren't fictional. Probably most expansively, probably the scene on the lightning bolt cracks in Utah in part 1. But there are a lot of routes that are fictional too. And I made the decision, really early on. I don't think it was a decision. I just always thought I knew I would do it, that I wanted a route that I imagined rather than one that existed. In part because whatever it was going to be way too difficult for me to climb. So there was just that needing to be credible. If it did exist, I would have to know it. But also, it's kind of an idealized route in some ways, having its particular flavor and topography and challenges.
The also thing that was interesting is the meshing of like modernization of, the climbing in the end of it versus the climbing in the beginning. You were very, like, obviously it mirrors your life in a way because you came back to climbing and discovered these gyms, and now you're looking at, these people and climbers who are athletic in a way that you couldn't even have conceived of in 1981, and just mind-blowingly good at what they're doing. So it was cool to have you incorporate that, and then you like, it's wild because you just got really into the change of ethics and the change of the way things were going to go down, and but you didn't really get bogged down into it. So can you talk about a little bit about that, like the idea of meshing the old and the new that ends up kind of happening in the end?
It's funny, I haven't thought out loud or thought about it consciously very much, except now that you're bringing it up, it seems to me that Will is the kind of embodiment or archetype of the modern climber.
Absolutely.
Purposeful, intentional, careful, just, amazingly athletic and precise. And, Joe talks at times about how what he and Pete had aspired to be, which was kind of this ethos and of this place. Will inhabits it, as his nativity, and it's natural and kind of easy for him in ways that it never was for Joe, and that Pete tried to make it become, and probably got there in some fashion. Will says at one point, Tommy Caldwell's the man. There you have whatever he is at the time, a 20-year-old, 22-year-old, I forget how old he is there, who emulates arguably the greatest living American climber, or certainly a very great living American climber. And I think Tommy Caldwell has that, is different from his father, who at one time was a climber too, I think. Just has all the tools, physical and mental, and a kind of modern approach that has its own ethics. I think they're fine, great ethics, but they are also, it's about projecting something projecting something that's unthinkably difficult rather than doing something in kind of quick, good style that's within your range.
I like too that, you had this evolution from Pete to him, just with how, and I've seen this like, in my own sort of history in climbing, and it kind of is connected back to 1981. 1981 is important in this whole thing. I know you try to downplay, but I believe it is, okay? But like, the seriousness and the, like, we are going up into this world, where we're going to meet our crucible and like suffer and come out the other side, these like changed men and all this sort of stuff. And then, and then it's like, I mean, Will has a crux issue that's weighing him, but everything else about way he approaches climbing is also modern in that sense. He just doesn't have, it's just not the weight of it. And I've noticed that so much, even with young people who are traditional climbers, who have gone the way of like a Tommy Caldwell, though Tommy's obviously an incredible sport climber too. They don't seem to like bring this weight. And I was the same way. I mean, it wasn't 1981. It could have been 1995 for me that like I brooded in the meadow and it was all very serious, and I could fall and die anytime. Like, and I just also like that because I saw myself in Joe of a evolution of, and he could have chosen a path where he found Will to be annoying and like losing the faith and like ruining climbing, which can be a old climber way of looking at the world. But yeah, so I mean, I don't really have a question in that, but maybe if that was also sort of deliberate in creating the character of Will.
Very, very much. I mean, I kind of wanted Will to be light on his feet, light in spirit. Yes, he does have he's got a lot of loss too, and he's reckoning with that in some deep ways. That would be his big life challenge. But there's something about Will that makes me feel like he could kind of walk away from climbing. Like, people talk about climbing being fun. I'm like, really? No, it's meaningful. It's deep. Right. It's about personal evolution. For Will, I think it's also it's about challenge and fun. So here's a passage where Joe's thinking about just what we've been discussing, his habit of sort of overlaying his climbing activities and aspirations with layers of meaning that they may or may not be able to sustain, or at least this gets it his inclination to do so. He says, "An only child, I was too frequently reminded several times by a Sunday school teacher that others of my mother's pregnancies had failed, both before I got here and after. Life in our circle was fragile and deeply contingent. The grace of God underlay everything. When I discovered climbing in college, I found the exposure and the mortal perils thrilling, but also profligate and unforgivable. Early on, I'd make bargains. Just this, then no more. To domesticate the dangers, I began to think of climbing as a kind of meditation or even prayer. But I never got far from wondering whether I'd fallen under some perversion of faith, some dark and disfiguring spirit whose most avid embodiment, of course, was Pete. In the past year, I'd sent postcards to several seminaries and divinity schools and made more than little noise about making a move." So there you see, I mean, at least a certain self-consciousness about this phenomenon you're describing of being for lack of a better term, maybe the seeker climber as opposed to the adventure climber. And, and mapping one's sense of self and one's aspirations for personal growth on this activity that's about fingers and toes and exposure.
Yeah, I mean, I was kind of wondering too, as a writer and as someone who starts to examine all these things, and I mentioned, having to try to explain them to other people, and in some ways, you don't do it didactically, but in this book you are sort of explaining these things and why they're meaningful and why climbers pursue them. Did that ever occur? I mean, did you ever sort of write yourself into a place where you're like, God, this is really dumb, or this doesn't actually make sense what we try to do up there? Or were you able to sort of keep the faith, to use a line from that reading, like that it is important, even though, it's bizarre and absurd and a ridiculous way to
my feeling is that
the flower of your life.
Yeah, I mean, my feeling is that this novel's fundamentally about Joe, and Joe would have these issues whether he were a climber or a bread baker or a surfer. He would just be mapping onto whatever he's doing these questions about ultimates and and purpose and meaning and that sort of thing. At one point, after Joe has left the East Side and he's on the phone with Pete, and they're both kind of groaning on, complaining about things. I think Pete's at this point onto climate change, and Joe's church is falling apart where he's a minister, and Joe writes that to something to I forget, to puncture the solemn tones or something like that. Pete said it might be an awesome enough responsibility just to enjoy your life, Joe. And I think that would be my answer to your question, that he's always negotiating those things wherever he is and however he is. He just happened to negotiate them in the context of climbing in the 1980s. And weirdly, somewhat, I don't know, possibly tragically, it turns out that was the most interesting and exciting, possibly appropriate context in which to negotiate them.
Why did you choose Native Air, and was that a working title from the beginning, or did you have some other ideas about what it would become?
It's the fifth title. The fourth was Inside of Native Air. The others, the first one is the most climbing oriented. It was called, the working title was A Fine Line, and my good friend in Boulder, Jimmy McClements, still likes that one. But anyway, Native Air is from the Dickinson poem. It's one of the epigraphs. It's about grief. It's the famous poem, I measure every grief I meet. And the stanza is, there's grief of want, there's grief of cold, a sort they call despair. There's banishment of native eyes in sight of native air. I like this angle and chose it because I think it gets at sort of two things. One is the grief that is, a centerpiece of the kind of feeling and drama and problem of the novel, death, or caused by death. And then there's also this, it speaks to what Joe is lacking when he decides to leave the Eastern Sierra and go back east and become a minister, which is that sense of being estranged from one's nativity. And I also like the fact that she's saying there's banishment of native eyes in sight of native air. You can't see air. All you can do is see things that are framed around air. And I think that gets at what Joe is. He's missing something elemental in his life, and to me, that is something that he got in the experience of climbing, the kind of exposure, the kind of friendship and partnership amidst that exposure and that danger and that adventure. You think you don't want it. You think you want to be, down there in the valley, in the mountain room bar, and it turns out that the only place that you're really connected and alive is when you're, I don't want to say suffering, but enduring or contending with that vulnerability that you get on a route, on a cliff, with a partner.
So I want to ask you a little more about process. Did you have a solid, constant reader on this thing, or were you?
Yeah,
did you do the spit it out and hand it to somebody thing?
No, it wasn't solid, constant, but because one of the things about reading is you only get to read something the first time once. And I'm super mindful of that, both as a reader and as a writer. I don't want to give something too raw to a first reader, because the second read will be so, shaped, colored, informed by the first read, even if things are profoundly different. So what I did was I wrote it in, it's a novel in 3 parts and an afterword. I would write a part, and each part took about a year, and then I would print it and give it to my partner, spouse, actually unmarried spouse, Courtney, and I would mail it to my mother. My mother's a very literary person. She's elderly. Today's her 89th birthday, but she's very with it. And this was 5-6 years ago. She was even healthier and stronger than she's right now. recovering from hip surgery. She broke her hip. But anyway, she's very savvy. And then the two of them would, basically, I didn't go into this with high expectations. So I was just looking for an honest, response. And they both really liked things. They both said the same thing to me after I gave them part one, which is, this is really cool, it's great, compelling, completely holds my attention, nicely written, etc. And you have a real problem. And anybody who reads the novel knows what the problem is at the end of part one, so I'm not going to spell it out here. And then, it was super fun to try to solve that problem. How are you going to make this as engaging and as layered, given what happens, at the end of part one?
So how big a roadmap did you have, or how concrete a roadmap did you have? Because there's all these ways in which to
I kind of
write,
had
and
markers.
people have their own methods,
I was really super aware of the fact that if you're going to write about anything that has climbing or mountaineering in it, it can't be a summit story, right? Because that's just hackneyed to hell, right? And it's also what everybody expects. And of course, the great paradox is that in some ways, Native Air is a summit story. Paradox to me, but it's not about how they got to the top, and a lot of the drama, most of the writing doesn't have anything to do with the route in question. Even though there are some pretty concentrated climbing scenes too. I knew that I wanted to, I wanted to sort of fulfill the Faulknerian axiom, which is one of the novel's epigraphs, that nothing ever happens once and is finished. So what we're doing in the novel is circling around and trying to make sense of and trying to connect and reconnect things that feel less available or lost. So that was helpful from as a guide, because I knew there'd be lots of looping back. And so it was just a question of timing and then also kind of location, when to loop back and how to provide context. I knew I wanted to do some things that would bridge the past to the future. And early in part one, Joe comes out to California with his wife at the time and walks into a climbing gym for the first time in 2007. And, is kind of jaw dropped. And that also becomes this way of reconnecting with climbing culture, which is, of course, exactly my experience. And then I knew that if the other theme that's kind of ubiquitous in the novel besides grief, it's male friendship, and Pete and Joe's friendship would be the center of gravity of part one, and that whatever it is that Joe had to offer Will and vice versa would constitute a center of gravity for the second half of the book. How did I pursue that? Technically, a lot of it was like listening to what I'd written, revising what I'd written, and then just trying to time things right. So, I know it sounds ridiculous, but there's a musical quality to, and I think it's more of an emotional musical, like how does the heart register and respond to where you are in this scene that determines what you do in the next scene. And, things can't be sustained at a really high pitch. They've got to get flat and mechanical and logistical and then sort of build back. Just trying to do that moving forward, but also invoking scenes and sequences from the past in order to get that kind of emotional effect. An example would be when Nor tells, two examples I'll give you. One is late in the novel when Nor tells Joe about her and Pete's first ascent of a route. It's a made-up route called Inventing the Difficulties on the Wheeler Crest. And it's the weekend that Pete learns that she's pregnant with Will. Well, and, it evokes a lot of the issues in their marriage, culminating in him telling her, just let me have some pride and joy for a few hours and you can have anger and regret for the rest of our lives. So. And then another one is the two digressive passages, one in part one and one in part two, with the Brits, Lester and Bill. Those were, two things that I fought hard to keep in the novel because they're obviously excisable. They don't advance any of the plot or the extant characters, but they're really important to me because they're about storytelling too. And they're also about climbing culture, and they're about tension, the tension that is always present in climbing, and the danger.
So you finished the book in a state that you at least want to send it off to someone to publish that's out of your hands, or at least try to get it published. How did you find you had changed after this process, or had you changed, or had it been an arrival at some sort of goal or new place for you, having gone through the process of creating these characters and living in them, specifically living in Joe because he was the narrator, or was it just like, oh, I'm done?
No, it wasn't. It certainly wasn't. I'm done. I honestly, it was unnerving. I felt very exposed. I mean, I got rejected by a lot of agents before Daniel Svetkov picked it up, and we got rejected by a lot of publishers before Green Riders Press picked it up. So you're hearing, one is hearing, I heard many, many times what people, always complimentary notes, almost always. I only got one nasty one. But there's something wanting. There's something inadequate. I just so hope that the novel does well enough that this nasty rejecter has to encounter it.
That's your mode. You're like, God, please be on a display case in an airport somewhere. You can jerk.
Actually, if the book does anything at all, it would have been really good for this particular press. It wasn't a big press, but no, I just felt really exposed, which was a little bit like climbing, honestly. I mean, I think my climbing activity had helped me in some ways not enjoy, but certainly survive and not overthink the levels of exposure and vulnerability that I felt trying to get this novel, out of the nest, as it were. And, honestly, there was some grief, too. I mean, I think as recently as a year and a half ago, I just thought it wasn't going to happen. It's just not going to be published. It's too literary for the climbing community. It's got too much climbing for the literary community, That would be the dirty rendering of why it wouldn't make it. So,
well, aside from that jerk rejection, how did you get this Bill Finnegan endorsement?
A climber friend, Kevin Starr, who's works for a foundation and is a doctor, and a good friend here in San Francisco, knows Bill through surfing. Kevin asked for the manuscript and sent it to Bill sometime in 2017, so a long time ago, right after I finished it, maybe early 2018. And then in 2019, Bill was cleaning out something in his home, either in New York or Connecticut, I forget, and he found it and hadn't looked at it, and he read it, and he just really liked it, and he called me in the spring of 2019. And we talked for 2 hours, the only time I've talked with him. His command of detail was just unbelievable. I mean, it was like listening to, a literary scholar read your work. He was just all kinds of things that he registered that I wouldn't expect a reader to be able to sort of summon in the context of a phone conversation. And, like a few weeks later, he sent my agent and me that endorsement. And then, we thought, the agent wrote to me and said, "This is a good day." We thought, oh, this is the ticket. And like I said, it wasn't. The other interesting thing Bill said, I don't think he'd mind my sharing this, is that he had a really hard time getting Barbarian Days out the door. Mm-hmm. And was even told at one point by his agent, do not publish it in this form. It's not going to make it. And, it's a freaking great book. I loved it. It's a Pulitzer Prize winner. You don't have to be interested in surfing or sports, I think, to really appreciate it, to enjoy it. And it obviously found the audience. So, that's what I'm hoping for.
Did the process of this, in the years since you've been revising it and trying to get it published, there's actually been more loss in your life, because in the very beginning of this interview, you bring up Jason Wells, who passed away in the interim. But has the process of dealing with that book helped you understand the original loss that you felt that compelled you to sort of dig into these ideas that were in your head? And also, has it changed the way you look at climbing at all?
Such different questions. Hard for me to hold them both in my head at the same time. I'm not sure it did change or influence my feeling and understanding of losing, of loss, of grief. I mean, as a writer, at some point you also feel just very manipulative. You realize that what you're doing here is you're causing feeling, as it were, trying to kind of engineer it. And so, when you do that with fiction and with language, the timing is really key. The not overplaying the hand is key. How you back away from it afterwards is key. And that's all about sort of, I don't know, it's art, theater. It's not really about grief, or my experience of grief. So I think I kind of maybe segregated those. I don't know. I guess the one thing I'd say is it never goes away, changes shape and temperature maybe, but never goes away. And I think that's true in the novel. It's true in my life. As you know, I don't have to do anything more than bring Bill or Jason to mind to really feel the sting of their loss. As far as climbing, I feel like I come to climbing with a greater, I don't know, self-possession, capacity for, personal reflection that relieves me of, again, freighting the climbing with things that it can't satisfy or sustain. So it can be more what it is, which is to say, totally focusing, very physical, intellectually compelling, fun at times, challenging. I like the way that it informs, shapes my practice in the rest of my life. Interesting culture, interesting people. Always taking itself too seriously, sometimes not taking itself seriously enough. Can't get that right. Full of all kinds of admiration for others and denigration of others. I mean, depending on their style or their practices or their values or how they're treating the crag. And I also like being. I mean, this is fun. I actually like being like the old guy at the cliff. That's in some ways a way more comfortable position for me to be than to have been the young guy at the cliff. I mean, probably the only thing I could claim by way of an accomplishment in climbing is that I'm climbing pretty much as well, as hard as I ever have, right now. And there aren't a lot of 61-year-olds doing that. So, and part of that is that, because most of those 61-year-olds used to climb things that were really hard. But, I'm holding my own by my standards, which is really cool.
All right, folks, thanks for listening, and thanks to Jonathan for connecting, talking about the hard subjects. Hopefully some of the things he said will stick with you for a while. And I think his book, Native Air, will stick with you as well, if you take the time to check it out. He would love for you to do that. Of course, purchase it, if you will. You can get it anywhere you get your books, but greenwriterspress.com is probably a good place to start. They have their affiliated links. They're the ones who took the chance and published Jonathan's book. And when someone puts their heart and soul into something like this novel, it's worth your consideration. It's worth your consideration. Okay. Also, when you're out there climbing, having fun this spring, of course, consider your knots. Consider your knots and check them.
We got amateurs at 12 o'clock. Check your safety.